I had a very different labs video planned for you guys. It's shot and edited, and we'll probably put it out next week. But this week, there's been enough happening that I want to cover some of it. It feels like a number of pivotal moments for the future of the country happened this week. Turning points, as a lot of people have pointed out. So let's talk about some of those, because the first thing that I really want to talk about that took a huge amount of people's attention this week was the murder of Irina Zarutska. Now, this happened 3 weeks ago, but it took time for people to really begin talking about this subway murder. But it went viral because there were 3 specific injustices that really caught people's attention. I think the theme of this conversation is going to be justice and injustice. So the first injustice in the subway murder was, well, on top of the murder itself, just the status of the victim. The fact that this young girl was a refugee and she was seeking safety and was believing that she was in a much safer country than Ukraine, and that is where she was murdered. And then the second great injustice is the murderer. The murderer had been arrested 19 times already and then constantly released by the city. The saying is, of course, mercy to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent. And this is probably one of the best examples of that. And then the third great injustice was total radio silence from the media. To completely ignore this story felt like a great injustice because the victim was being snubbed and the other injustices were being completely glossed over. Now, this was eventually hugely discussed on social media because murder is a very serious business and injustice really gets under people's skin. My family's been reading in Deuteronomy recently. We just finished. And Deuteronomy 21 talks about how city leaders need to absolve the city of blood guiltiness, even if they can't find the criminal, because murder is such a big deal. Now, obviously, this situation is not that situation. The perpetrator seems to be well identified at this point. But the city leaders did not see this murder as a big deal. The Charlotte, North Carolina council members actually paused the discussion about the murder to have a party and eat cake, demonstrating that to them this was just not that important. And that also, I think, explains why mainstream media ignored it for so long. In the grand scheme of things, when you look at what mainstream media is trying to accomplish these days, this was not a big deal. A lot of the media attention is clearly being driven by some kind of political expediency. So cherry-picking stories that fit a desired narrative, that push for a specific argument or a specific political action, and this story didn't do that. Now, eventually, there was enough discussion about this particular murder on social media. There were enough people talking about it that mainstream media finally picked it up. This is where things begin at the beginning of this week. And the way that the media covered that was, Republicans pounce. MAGA people are infuriated by the actions of a mentally ill black man. Trump supporters focused only on race, etc., stuff like that, which is frustrating and infuriating when the point that people actually wanted to make was one of justice and injustice. And the journalists covering the story were sometimes angrier that online media people had noticed the murder than the actual murder itself. And this is where Charlie Kirk enters the story, because he commented on this murder quite a bit. And that was very annoying to Van Jones at CNN and directed a lot of hate directly at Charlie Kirk this week. And as you know, Wednesday afternoon, Charlie was murdered. He was assassinated. And it's been a while since we've seen an assassination like this. And an incredible, once again, incredible levels of injustice. Now, one thing about this case was very different. The media was not quiet until they couldn't talk about it anymore. They were actually very quick to talk about Charlie Kirk, even before they knew really what had happened. Now, to be fair to media, this is the kind of story that they should report on immediately and give people running updates on. And Charlie Kirk is a much larger celebrity. He has a pretty big following. He's much more interesting of a person. He'd already been in the news that week, so this is much more newsworthy. But certain channels and certain commenters were not just commenting on Charlie Kirk because he was newsworthy. It was politically expedient to talk about what was happening in Utah. And some political opinions came out. The TMZ staff were heard cheering when they finally learned that he had passed away. And MSNBC probably got the most attention because they had folks on their panel acting almost smug. Oh, what did Charlie actually expect? You know, you can't be a hate monger without getting consequences. And Matthew Dowd, to MSNBC's credit, has been fired for those remarks. But what's interesting to me was watching the different reporters demonstrate their total lack of knowledge. This is not particularly unexpected for professional journalists, but the people in front of the cameras were speaking very authoritatively about who Charlie was without knowing anything about what he did or what he actually believed or even what he had actually said. They were like NPCs repeating lines, which, again, your on-camera reporters often do this. They read from teleprompters or from earpieces. But what's interesting is when you have a breaking story like this and they're waiting for facts, they fill in the gaps with their actual ad libs. And what they had were only generic NPC reporter talking points and memorized slogans. So all of the tropes that you've heard before. He was a polarizing figure. He had controversial opinions. He's a far-right activist. He's got hateful rhetoric. He's inciting violence. And he's a radicalized extremist. These are phrases that just came out when they were trying to fill the airtime, waiting for the next bulletin update or the next earpiece update. These are the things that people believe about Charlie Kirk without any evidence, because Charlie Kirk was not an extremist. In fact, he's basically what all mainstream Republicans were in the early 90s. But today, in 2025, he was very effective as a speaker, and he was a Christian, and he wasn't backing down from various attacks from the media. And his trajectory has been really solid. To be honest, when I first came across Charlie Kirk, this would have been 12 or 15 years ago. He was 18 years old, and I saw him popping up at events. And he was actually kind of annoying back then. But he was also annoyingly talented. And over time, he grew in a tremendous amount of wisdom and maturity. He's honestly one of the least hateful and least extreme conservative voices that you can find, with a lot of listeners on the right wing today. And it was because of the lies about him that I believe he was shot in a very public place and in a very public way. Now, there's no hard evidence on exactly what happened yet, and it's possible that we may never know exactly who was involved. Was it a cool, calculating political operator who knew that a stable Christian family man was far too effective to live and was eventually going to run for office, and doing this thing would dissuade other leaders? Or was it just another NPC who had listened to the other MSNBC NPCs talk about this far-right extremist threatening democracy for years and years and years, and then at a scheduled event, he did exactly what he had heard needed to be done? It's very hard to say. I will say that one of the best pieces of evidence that we have as to who the shooter may have been is the fact that now, 24 hours later, he is still not in custody. But now, 24 hours later, the criticism of Charlie Kirk has not stopped. There's definitely a few people that have walked back some of the things they've said in the past. There's several people on X and Instagram who have deleted past posts about Charlie Kirk, trying to cover up some of their more inflammatory stuff. But there's also plenty of people who are not doing that. There's a huge amount of just incredible vitriol online. Rejoicing and people laughing at the grief and loss of his wife and his children, and hoping for more death and misery for people like him. Most people on the internet don't have the slightest clue what is going on or what is true, but they're very bold in their declarations, even more so than the NPCs in front of the cameras at MSNBC. A huge portion of the internet are NPCs. There's actually lots of bots, but there's a lot of human players on there that operate on nothing but tribalism as opposed to truth. So do you remember a few weeks ago there was another story involving an Indian truck driver who killed 3 people in a U-turn down in Florida? And shortly after that, even though it was clearly an illegal U-turn, there were 2 million signatures on a petition to drop the charges against him. 2 million people who did not care about the facts, they didn't care about the details, but this guy was either part of their tribe, or the people who were calling for him to be held responsible were on the other tribe, and it didn't really matter which. That was enough for them to sign the petition. And I think that all of us have started to think this way a little bit. And it may be things like just internet reviews. If you are reviewing a product on Amazon, say, and you think that product deserves a 4-star rating, but the current rating is 5, you probably give it 1 star. You have to vote either all or nothing if you want to move the needle that you want to move. This wild exaggeration is how you get these things done. That's how your side takes ground. And this is a major defect in current online culture. Now, I want to be very clear about something though. While both sides, both tribes have NPCs that operate purely on tribal allegiances and not on truth, I'm not saying that these 2 murders that we've talked about are a both sides have faults issue. That is a major talking point of generic politicians on both sides, and that is a generic talking point of mainstream evangelical Christian leaders. A lot of people have just completely wimped out here, and they're blaming generic issues, generic systemic problems, faults on both sides, culture in general, no specific bad actors. And those kinds of statements, whether they're from mainstream politicians or mainstream Christian leaders, I would say are actually worse than even the naked tribalism, because it's even more deceitful. It hides the underlying issues instead of just ignoring them. And it's definitely worse coming from the Christian leaders, because God has a standard that can be applied, and there's no neutrality on these issues. And Christian leaders are required to apply that standard. Isaiah says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil," and it goes on and on to criticize and condemn those people who do this. Christian leaders, especially, cannot be so squishy as to pretend that God's standard is quiet on these issues. God's standard applies to all of life, and it is sufficient for all of life, and it's needed now more than ever when the world is devolving into just pure tribalism or cowardly neutrality. God's standard is not silent about truth or lies, right or wrong, life or death. Tribalism is bad, but that doesn't mean that all tribes are equally bad. You can actually point out wrong and right. You can actually point out injustice and call for justice. And if we can just talk about the tribes for a minute, they don't have an equal footing here. Irina was a random victim, I believe, but the situation surrounding her death, the murderer's ability to kill her, the pragmatic downplaying of a horrific death, these are the direct result of left-wing political policies, a particular tribe. Charlie's killer is still unknown for now, but what we do know is he chose to murder the most effective Christian debater and debunker of left-wing policies, someone who has been constantly attacked by one tribe. And it's not just actions. The standard that we have in Scripture is sufficient for us to look at certain policies. We can compare them to Scripture and see whether or not they are righteous. It's true that both the right and the left, and there's more than just 2 tribes on the internet, of course, yeah, they have cultural issues that they need to deal with. But one tribe is much more widely calling for murder, calling for more murders of the innocent, and actually performing more murder. I think it's very important not to mince words here. Whether it's leftists, activists demanding that more abortions take place, or maybe the bureaucrats issuing phony commercial driver's license to untested immigrants, or Democratic governors, or maybe candidates promising that they will release more violent criminals onto the streets because jail is unfair. Or even the left-leaning commenters who are demanding that someone put a stop to right-wing extremists by any means necessary. There is one tribe that is demanding more injustice than injustice, and actual murder. God's law forbids murder, and we should talk about this more at T-Rex Arms. The entire purpose of T-Rex Arms is to be a Second Amendment company and a Sixth Commandment company. All of our equipment is, in some ways, life-preserving equipment, whether it's direct medical stuff, or whether it's preventative self-defense equipment, or whether it's training and preparation equipment. And we believe that the Bible is not silent on these things. Justice is required in all types of situations, from the most horrific murders, and we've just seen 2 incredibly horrific murders. I was just talking about this with some of the other folks in the shop. Cold-blooded murder can either be a completely impulsive action, like what happened in that Charlotte subway, like a murder almost just in passing, no thought whatsoever to the value of human life. Or it can be cold-blooded and horrific in its calculated manner, the amount of preparation that is required to do a political assassination in a very public place. These are the most premeditated and hateful, or the most hateful and passive, casual, cold-blooded murders that we've seen on camera in a very long time. But there's also injustice in the kind of online commentary that is praising these things. Either of these events, and the fact that they are captured on camera, I think helps this in many ways. But the fact that people are responding in such a polarized, tribal fashion is also helpful in, I say helpful not in a necessarily good way. They are powerfully moving the Overton window. Either of them would have incredible culture forming and tribal motivating factors involved. Lots of people were commenting, "Well, I'm radicalized now," when they saw early footage of the subway murder, but now we have 2, in some ways, similar events in 1 week. So I just want us to think about what happens next. First of all, I want to say that I am so glad that Charlie was able to accomplish so much, now that we know that his time on Earth was so short. And I'm heartbroken that his wife has lost him, that his children will grow up without their father. And I got to confess to you guys that I am fearful that this situation is going to get out of control, and some of the people on the 2 tribes will not actually survive the conflict. But I want you to know that I'm also encouraged and emboldened by other people and the way that they are responding to this. I'm emboldened looking back at some of the things that Charlie Kirk preached and stood for, and the courage that he had in doing those things. We posted about this on social media on Wednesday, and we talked about the need for both prayer and preparation. Preparation to protect, but also prayer. And anytime there's a horrific event like this, there are people who talk about prayer on social media and mention that they are praying. And then there's also the backlash, people mocking prayer, people asking, what good is prayer, since Charlie Kirk was a praying man and he died anyway? Well, as a number of people have pointed out, Charlie didn't pray that he wouldn't be killed by a sniper bullet that day. Charlie prayed that he would have a massive constructive and restorative impact on our culture, and that he would be able to preach the gospel and leave a legacy, which I believe that he will. Last week, there's so many of these different events. Last week, children were shot in a church while they were praying, and people mocked the prayers of those children and the prayers of the saints afterward. But I'm doubling down on prayer here. And I think that we need to talk about preparation and prayer simultaneously. There are people who say, why would you pray when you could prepare? But they're not opposing sides. God's word is very clear that God is sovereign, but man also has total responsibility. This is not a Venn diagram that has a little bit of overlap. These are basically the same circle. The Bible talks about praying without ceasing and not being weary of doing good. These are things that you do simultaneously. They inform each other, and we need to be doing both. So stay prepared. And there's a lot of things I think to prepare for. But the preparing that I'm talking about is preparing to protect other people. And in all things, I want you guys to continue praying. Right now, pray for the Kirk family, that they would be comforted in this time. I also want us to be praying for justice. So many of these things infuriate us because they are such clear injudicious actions. It is so important that the state actually do justice and catch and execute criminals. Criminals who commit murders are their highest priority. But I also want us to pray for peace. And these things are not diametrically opposed. Again, these things require one another. Peace is more than just the absence of direct conflict. You must have justice to have true peace. And then I also want to encourage you guys to be courageous. You just saw on Wednesday one of the very real consequences of being courageous. This is a consequence that we generally don't see here in America, but throughout all of history and other parts of the world, the consequence of being courageous is occasionally death. But you're also seeing the fruit of courage. The number of people who have been encouraged by Charlie Kirk, the number of people that have been encouraged even by the conversation around these events, to grow in courage and to be even more bold in their resolve. So, be courageous.